You always thank the people that sponsor and host and support you, and Jack, true thanks. It's truly a pleasure, and furthermore, there are a number of people around the room, and there's some who couldn't be here, and they've sent me emails that really helped me while I was at USC to develop the insights and the perspective to be able to put some of them down and to write this book. And I want to start with thanking Dan Masmanian, who brought me to the school, and furthermore, we co-wrote with a number of others articles about sustainability and what it is and what it means and how, in fact, you arrive at that. And you'll see many of those ideas, Dan, reflected in the writing of this book. And along with Dan was Yang Tang, and Jan was an important co-author in the area of how do we develop fiscal sustainability that matches up with our environmental sustainability. And again, those are really fundamental ideas, and I would be remiss if I didn't thank Dow. Dow Myers is the true demographer. He sort of were I learned for years, not only here, but also when I was at SCAG. Dow and his work fed into our work. And the work that we did, I mean, I need to thank the organization that I worked for 32 years. It gave me a different perspective than most practitioners. It allowed me not only to work for 76 elected officials whom I reported directly to, and that was an education in and of itself. But the organization was trusted with looking long term, and there are very few people who can say they spent their career looking at the long term. And when you look at the long term, and you don't look backwards, you look forward. I mean, academia, we look backward, and that's our bread and butter, is to evaluate what went on in the past and to see what goes on. But when you're working for an organization whose charge is to develop the vision, the goals, the plans, the strategy for how you sustain an economic region, and we're one of the largest economic regions in the country and one of the large mega regions in the world, you develop a different way of, or you have a different lens on the world. And let me start, before I move on and not thank people, I want to thank the person who drove me here, who encouraged me on a daily basis when I said, do I really need to do this, to put these ideas on paper? My wife, Jane, and I won't tell you how long our relationship, because it would truly age us. And one last person, Donna Ward, and I don't see Donna in the room right now. Oh, there he's Donna. Donna, your preparation for today couldn't have been better, and the ease of which you put it all together, and you were so easy to work with. Coming back to...
The only thing I want to add, Mark, is for those of you who don't know, Jane is actually, along with Dan, former dean of the school, so this is one of the occasions where we have three deans in the room.
Yes, Your Highnesses. Yes, Your Highnesses. All three of you. The perspective that I was able to work on for those 32 years showed to me the importance of looking at the whole. You can't understand the future if you look at one dimension. You can't look at one discipline. You have to look at the whole, and you have to understand how the whole fits together. And furthermore, you have to understand how people make up the whole. And let me repeat that. People are the foundation of our society. We don't think of them as our bosses, but what I came to learn through this book was that individuals making individual choices collectively, if you can understand it and put it together and evaluate it, you come up with insights that you never thought plausible, possible, and you begin to understand the puzzle that many things are today. And our economy and our politics and our governance is truly, truly a puzzle. I think that no other word more aptly describes the time we're living in other than it's puzzling. Some call it dysfunctional, chaotic, etc. I just call it puzzling because we don't really fully understand it. And hopefully some of the insights from this book will lead to a better understanding of that puzzle, and it also will lead to a better understanding of the politics. And I'm going to cover four things. One, the key findings of the book. Secondly, how I arrived at those, what were the causes of the findings, and what was the analysis behind those findings. The third thing I will cover, and that is what are the impacts? What are the impacts on the economy, and also some of the insights as to how those impacts affect our politics. And the third, and it's a part of the book that was the most fun for me, and that is what can you do about it? I mean, what are the possible strategies and what thought processes that can lead to solve and to deal with some of the puzzles that we're facing today. Okay, the perspective and the lens that I look at this, and I said it before, is people. And I was trained as an economist, and let me be, I didn't brag about this when I was in the School of Public Administration, but I was trained as an econometrician. I did my doctoral work in that area, and I'm very familiar with the tools and the insights and the limitations of that discipline. So looking at people and that's the lens is demography, graphic portrayal of human behavior. The one variable that I looked at, and this was another insight that I got from possibly being the age that I am, I looked at what is aging doing within the demographic profile to all the economic behavior. We tend to look at the race, ethnic, and the people and the other aspects of demography and not focus on age. And I just looked at that one variable, and exclusively that one variable. What happens to our economic behavior as we grow and reach our peak earning period of, on average, 55 years, and what happens to our economic behavior as we go beyond 55. And furthermore, I looked at how does aging move in that change in age move through all the different demographic decades and cohorts. And the basic conclusion that I arrived at was the collective behavior of that demographic behavior of aging, only aging, in the year 2016 generated a demographic penalty. And I'll explain that in the next part of my talk. A demographic penalty of $646 billion for the year 2016. It's just 1 year, one slice. And that penalty caused Barack Obama's forecast of his economic growth for the nation that he made when he came into office, that caused his demographic forecast to be wrong. That one single variable, the aging in the population. He happened to become president at the wrong time in the demographic profile of this country, and others, and I'll speak to that later, were president at the right time. Second, well, let me just take the 604. If you added that to the $456 billion of dollars of economic growth, if you added the two together, the 2% growth that we had in 2016, it's a little under 2, to be 4.5% GDP growth for the year 2016. That's how significant this one single variable in demographic profile is. Had we had the same demographics that we had in the year 2001, when we shifted from demographic bonus to demographic penalty, and I'll explain that in the next section, that singular change caused Barack Obama to have, from an economic perspective, many say his term in office was not a stellar economic performance. It wasn't due to Barack Obama, it was due to the collective behavior of all of us. Moving forward to 2017 through 2000, and let's just say the next 4 years. I'm not going to say whose term, but the next 4 years. The presidency of Donald Trump, the annual income penalty will be $673 billion per year. and how that penalty impacts on the GDP growth is something I'll speak more to within the talk. Secondly, the consumption penalty for the next 4 years is going to be $290 billion a year of consumption that will not occur within the country because of this aging phenomenon in the population. And most importantly to this school and to what I'm concerned about and to why I started this research, the impact on the amount of taxes paid per year will be $320 billion. In other words, by not having the same demographic profile we had at the turn of the millennium to right now, it's $320 billion, and it's growing. And I'll explain that these are just the next 4 years, but the next 20 years, and I stopped after 20 years. I got discouraged enough by looking that far out. And furthermore, all the numbers I'm citing to you are in constant 2015 dollars. So inflation and all of the rest of the business cycle activity is taken out of the numbers. Just to put these numbers in perspective as to how significant they are, and I argue in the book that the demographic penalty, this aging penalty, is larger than our fiscal and monetary policy tools combined. The following observation, and that is, the tax cut that we just enacted had a withdrawal or a total impact on the economy of some say about 1.5, others say 2.2. I'm going to take the upper number and say, okay, it's a $2.2 trillion tax cut, 210 billion a year. Well, these penalties are orders of magnitude larger than even the tax cut. And if you want to take the 10-year penalty for income for taxes paid, we're likely to lose in income in taxes not paid by individuals, and I'll explain more about that when I go through the calculations. But it's several. It would be close to $3 to $4 trillion a year of taxes that we're not going to be collecting. And furthermore, the GAO and CBO, and I'll speak to that, they're not including this in any of their calculations. That these penalties are significantly larger than the actions that we're taking. Now, one of the insights that I learned from Dow was if you're going to look at any kind of demographic activity in the future, look backwards and portray how it performed, how your analysis and your conclusions performed backwards as well as look forward. And I took and I call it the Dow-Myers test. And so the modeling and the analysis that I did looked backwards 3 decades and it looked forward 3 decades. And just to give you an idea of how well it performed, prior to the year 2001, when baby boomers reached 55, and all of a sudden the demographic impact, which prior to those years were positive, in the decade of the 80s and 90s, and those who were president in the year 1990, Bill Clinton was the luckiest president that we ever, of modern times. His economic performance, which everyone says was his contribution to our economy, and Janet Yellen, and there was a whole group of people who've written about the decade of the 1990s was the Goldilocks period. That's what it's called. In fact, she has a book out by that title. Well, what I found was that the economic contribution or bonus during that decade, we had 2 recessions in the 90s, and we still had the best economic performance of any decade in modern times, was blessed with and I calculated a $300 billion positive contribution of a much smaller economy and a $200 billion increase in the demographic increase in taxes that were paid because we had a heck of a lot more workers and we had very few retirees in that time period. So I trace back 3 decades, and in the book there's a description of, well, we did this policy in this time period, what was the real impact and what was this demographic influence? And when you can crosswalk the two, you begin to see how lucky Bill Clinton and a few others in that decade were. The next section is, how did I calculate this, and how did I come upon even the insight to calculate this? Well, the first insight was that I looked at the decade of the baby boomers. And the baby boomers were a very unusual generation that went through our existence. And it's their economic performance that really gave me the economic insight. And I'm just going to cite a couple of observations from the boomers. In the year 2010, and at this time, the baby boomers were around 40, they were around 45, 46 years old. During that decade, they were 30% of the country's population. They earned 54% of the nation's income. So 30% of the population and the workers earned 54% of the nation's income, and they paid 50% of all the taxes. So fast forward them to the year 2010. By this time, they're starting to retire. They reached their peak earning in 2001. But in that particular decade, they were 26% of the population, and they were still 40% of the nation's income. And furthermore, they paid 43% of all of the personal taxes. Well, let me put personal taxes in perspective. 90% of all government's revenues in the United States, there's 17 different tax variables, come from people, from those 17 tax categories. So 90% of all of the monies being paid, local, state, and federal, all came from, they come from individuals. And the baby boomers, even though they were only 26% of the population, were still paying almost half the taxes of the country. And so that gave me an insight. Well, something's going on here, and you better take a look at it. Which then led me to start taking very large, big databases. I mean, what I was able to use was the large databases that the federal government started collecting in the 70s and 80s, and they primarily were charged by Congress to look at what's the impact of all of our social programs. But one of the most important byproducts is the tools that are bread and butter. We use these databases. And the 4 that I used were the American Community Survey, the Current Population Survey, the Consumer Expenditure Survey. And the Consumer Expenditure Survey, I'm going to suggest, is probably the most underutilized of all of the databases that the federal government collects on people. In fact, it's one of our most important analytical tools. And then I worked with the Census Bureau, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, just the world of big data. And I used the econometric models that I had learned, and I worked with a colleague of mine, Frank Wen at SCAG, and their demographic unit. And Frank is also an econometrician and a demographer. I mean, I hired Frank for those specific purposes 25 years ago, and the most valuable use of that hiring decision was Frank enabled me to, in fact, pull the databases, and collectively we were able to build the models. And I really thank Frank profusely for his assistance in the book. But let me just say one more thing about the CEX. It's 7,000 samples, but more importantly, it's 14,000 individual diaries that individuals keep about all of their economic activity. I had a personal experience this month, and that is I was chosen, Jane and I were chosen to be one of the diaries for the CEX survey for the year that we're now in. So I'll now have to I mean, I've never been asked to fill out anything by one of these. Very seldom do I do I get called to say, I'm surveying you for this, that, but I'm more than happy to participate. Anyway, I took the CEX survey, which talks about all the different forms of incomes of the individuals they survey, all the different expenditures that they make, all the consumption behaviors. So you have all of the income data for these 14,000 surveys, and you have all of the expenditure, and furthermore, you have all of the tax data. I mean, for all these 17 different tax variables, and that's year by year, starting with 1984. So I took the years that I thought were important, and I took 8 different profiles, and I based them, related them back to the age, to the income years, to the expenditure years, and to the taxes. And from that database was able to construct a framework that enabled me to develop the age elasticities of income, consumption, and taxes paid. That means you age a year, and you can, instead of price being the determinant, age is now the variable, or you're able to develop a profile of the behavior of individuals collectively within the U.S. And furthermore, I was able to look back 30 years, and using the census forecast, I was able to look forward 30 years and have elasticities for each year in that time period. And I ran with Frank 7 different models, and what we found was incredibly consistent behavior on how these age elasticities perform. From 1984 to the year 2014, the age elasticity curves varied only by a few percentage points between each successive year. So that it gave me enough confidence to say, yes, these elasticity curves of income, consumption, and taxes paid are reliable, and they're something that, in fact, you could write about and evaluate post and looking forward. And it also enabled me to relate it to my own personal life, my income as I grew up to 55 and what happened, and relate it to just other individuals that I know and observe in different income categories. And it performs consistent with everything that I observed and everything that I experienced with respect to the behavior. And let me just share some of those elasticities. And I'm not going to bore you with a lot of statistics, but a few. Prior to the year 2000, all of the age elasticities for income, consumption, and taxes paid were all positive. In other words, this country, we were experiencing positive behavior because of the number of workers that were in the working age population in our society, and the older retirees. And in fact, in the decade of the 90s, there were extremely low number of retirees, and there was an extremely large number of working age population. And it's all started to change in the decade of 2000 to 2010, and lo and behold, that's when the baby boomers reached 55. And what did I observe in the decade of the first decade? And let me just say what I observed in the decade that we're now in. The elasticity of income, meaning what's the change in income based upon age in the year 2000, and this is all for the year 2015, 16, was a 24% decline in income in the growth rate of income in the country. Let me just explain that. The growth rate in income, because you had a lot more workers, you had fewer workers, and you had a lot of retirees, that the aggregate amount of income that the country was generating had a growth rate of minus 0.24%. The growth rate in consumption was 15.15%. And here's the variable that I was really looking for It shocked me at first, but enabled me to understand why a couple of things that I observed in my planning career at SCAG were happening was that the growth rate in taxes paid, and I want to remind you, that's 90% of the taxes paid to the federal government, the state government, and local governments. This is the bread and butter that drives the work of this school, of the public sector, had a 0.44% negative growth rate per year. And furthermore, that growth rate compounds each year, just as when you have positive increases in growth, you have a compounding effect. Well, when you go down, you have the same compounding effect. So if you have a 0.44% growth rate, a negative growth rate in taxes paid, that means government is getting less and less money. And I'll speak more to the impacts that these elasticities have when I get into the next section. But without question and without doubt, this one single variable change, I felt, explains more than the CE, and I read the economic report of the president, and I read the CBO forecast. At the National Academy, the panel that I co-chair, we have CBO members, GAO members. They're all part of the community, and they come and make presentations to our panel on a regular basis. What I found was that these elasticities and these demographic changes probably explain more of what's happening in the economy today and the puzzling dynamics of the economy than all the various reports I was hearing from them. A couple of other observations about just the analysis and how I put it together, and that is, in addition to looking at elasticities, I looked at another variable, and this has been well written in the press and in the journals, et cetera, and that is just the growth rate in working age population. I'm just going to give you a couple of observations because this work is much more documented, but in order to make sense out of this, the book presentation, what I found was that prior to the year 2000, the number of working age population, the growth in working age population in those decades was 74% of the population were in the working age population. And interestingly enough, in 2015, that is flipped, and it's now 68% of the growth in the population in the United States are people over 65. Let me repeat that. 68% of the population growth in this, and by the way, this region performs right at the national average. The majority of our population are people over 65. And let me put these into number terms. Prior to the into the year 2000, the annual growth, the decade growth of people in the working age, that's 15 through 64, there were 22 million people per decade. In the decade that we're now in, there are 9 million. In the 2 decades following us, there will be 5 million people in the working age population. So it doesn't take hard math to figure out that the unemployment discussion that we had in the first decade is just okay. We had a fair number of people entering into the working age population. Right now, we have very few entering into the working age, and it's going to get less and less. And some of the other issues that I'll talk about in a minute, you're going to see that we're really working ourselves, I think, into a working age population issue that probably is the critical issue for the nation. I can think of no single issue that is more important than the growth in the working age population if we're to deal with our economic and some of our other social issues. What were some of the underlying forces that led to this demographic change? And I'll be fairly quick on this. The first is the fertility rate. There's no other single driver to this demographic change than the fertility rate, and a couple of observations about it. Post-World War II, in the booming period of the 1950s through up to the end of the century, the fertility rate of women in the United States was 3.8 children per working age for women in the childbearing years. Near the end of the century, and that continued post-war up to about 1980, and with the social transformations that occurred in our country, in the fact that women became control over themselves and their reproduction, the fertility rate plummeted to 1.8 for women who were born in the United States. And the reason that we were above replacement was because of immigrants. The fertility rate of immigrants allowed us to be above replacement until about a couple of years ago, when now the United States is below replacement. Over 60% of the world's population are now below replacement, and only 3% of the world's population live in countries where the fertility rate is actually increasing. So the social changes that occurred in the last part of the last century, and the importance of women being more in control of their own destiny has had a dramatic impact on the numbers that I'm talking about. The second issue was longevity. And equally important in the last several decades of the last century, you saw the country focusing on safety, on environment, on reducing risk within all categories of social existence, and you put those all together, and what you find is that the longevity in the United States has increased 7 years in the last 2 decades, and globally it's increased 11 years. So there's been a real focus towards recognizing the importance of individuals and the importance of maintaining and preserving life. And longevity has been a second major driving force. A third major driving force has been immigration. And in the area of immigration, nothing is clearer than the immigration that we experienced in this country from 1945 to about 1970, 1980. There was a national consensus that immigrants, our soldiers brought their friends and their wives home, et cetera, and we just had an open, relatively speaking, an open society. And immigration was positive, and it was viewed as a positive contributor to our country. Within the last decade or 2 decades, that's changed. And the most important telling observation that I was able to find in my research, in the year 2012, the Department of Census, and they go through an extremely impressive process for determining immigration and immigration flows and what's likely to happen. The Department of Census, in developing the forecast, reduced the immigration in 2012 by 38%. They forecasted between now and the year 2040 that instead of having 65.8 million immigrants, we're going to have 41.2. And I would say that the political activities of the last 4 or 5 years, we're going to be lucky to have the 41.2. I mean, the fact that the world is all clamoring to come here and wants to come here, probably based on what I've read in the census surveys, is not the case. That it was naturally beginning to decline. 38% is not insignificant, and what we're likely to do is that we're and by the way, the numbers that I used in doing all of the forecasts assume the 41.5%. We're not likely to have the working age population that we're now talking about, because that's who normally immigrates to this country. Okay, what are the impacts of these kinds of observations on our society? Well, the first thing that I found was I looked at the median income and why Americans, this was a big political debate. Americans haven't received a salary increase in the last almost 20 years. Well, when I plotted the fact that 37 million people, and when I looked at all the analysis by cohorts, 37 million people had income declines, and only 10.8 had any income increases. When I aggregated them, you came up with the penalties that I talked about. When you then distribute those to the quintiles, which you look at when you look at median income, what I basically found was that the the decline in the demographics of this one variable was 4 times larger than the decline in income going from a manufacturing to a service economy. These age, penalty, income effects swamped, quote, let me repeat, swamped the income effect of well, we lost all our manufacturing jobs abroad, and that's what caused, no, that's not what caused the decline in median income. One thing I did not write about because I didn't have time to do all the needed sensitivity work, I tried to, but I'm doing that work now, is what's the impact on equity? And what I'm finding is that when you have so many retiring people, and even though the retirees are doing better relative to other income categories in the comparisons, what you find when you distribute the number of retirees and the lower income into the quintiles, it probably explains why the equity issue is getting worse, not better, even though we've been paying attention to it for the last 20 years. We've not been focusing, in my estimation, on the real underlying potential reasons why we're having inequities in our society, and it's because of this age change within that is occurring. One other observation, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I'm going to mention it here, and that is the whole notion of growth and the paradoxes surrounding growth is not only an analytical issue, not only is it a policy issue, but it has dramatic impacts on the economy, and that is there's been a movement towards growth is not desirable. Sustainability and growth, and Dan, from our work, I mean, those are at loggerheads and there's tension there. Well, there's more than tension between economic, environmental sustainability and environmental sustainability that we're going to have to figure out we're going to have to, both on a policy level and on a practical level, we're going to have to deal with the fact that growth is, it's a paradox, and how you balance that paradox led me to some of the solutions in the book. The final area that I want to just talk a little bit about the impacts are on the area of the public revenues. And it's why I started this book, and I alluded to it earlier. In the last 5 to 10 years of my tenure at SCAG, I began to see that the amount of revenues, because we had to have constrained financial plans. You needed them for air quality conformity, et cetera. I even helped write the legislation surrounding this. And what I was observing that when I first started at SCAG, the plans that I and my staff were preparing were 80 to 90% funded. When I left SCAG, they were 40 to 45% funded. That the fiscal issues in government, anyone looking long-term knew that what we were, I came to the conclusion, why develop these plans if they're not going to be funded and carried out? I was wasting my time and my contribution to society. And so therefore, I said, gee, one of the reasons that attracted me to come here was to say, what's behind all this? Well, the issue of fiscal stress is alive and well today, and let me just give you 2 observations. In 2016, the federal government, the revenues flowing to the federal government were less than they were in 2015. And 17 data is not out, but the federal government is actually collecting, yes, less money from personal income. And this was before the tax cut debate and discussion. So if we think we have federal stress at the federal level now, between the demographic tax penalties and the fact that they've already hit, we're going to have absolute less money going to the federal government, and the local government, their revenue streams are a little more inelastic because of property taxes and a few others, but it won't be long before local and state government hit the same wall. So the issue of how we deal with this is really on the table. I went and visited CBO, and CBO is the premier forecaster right now. CBO, and I said, do you have a demographics built into your model? And they said, well, we do have a demographic baseline. I said, can I see your equation to see whether you're factoring in this penalty? They will not share it with you. They do not share their model with Congress, and Congress has to accept the fact that they're appointed impartially by both parties and that the staff is looking after the reliability. But let me just tell you, they have a black box, and I don't know what's in it. And neither did the people at GAO, because I visited with GAO, and GAO said, Mark, you're right. We do not build this into our forecasts. They do the same revenue forecast for local government. They're planning to do so in the future. And the final observation I will make about modeling, and that is I was trained as an econometrician. Econometricians do not look at demographic change. They do not factor it into their models. The models that the Federal Reserve, that our banks, that our businesses all use, do not factor in any of these demographic considerations. So one of the issues that I felt I needed to state in the book was modelers and forecasters, you better take a look at people as you make these forecasts. Let me just make one other observation about the public sector, and it was a New York Times article Wednesday of this week. The New York Times article talked about employment in government. And I'm just going to, if you haven't read the article, read it. I'm not saying to read my book, but read it. But read the article, and let me just give you a couple of observations. Employment per year for government in the 1950s through the 1980s was 350,000 persons per year were hired by government. In the decade of the 90s and the first decade in this century, it began to change. It dropped down to 300,000 per year. In 2015, 31,000 people were the positive net add to government employment in the country. So you know, between the increased cost of ongoing obligations, health and others, and the declining revenue streams, that the employment going into the public sector has been declining precipitously. And I think that we, in our work in this school, given that that's whom we're primarily educating, that we really need to focus and understand how these changes are impacting overall. What can be done? And let me just, and when the publisher saw an article that I had written on this and asked me to turn it into a book, I said, I won't do it. I do not want to have my tombstone read, he's Debbie Downer. Because what I've told you is really pessimistic, and it's really discouraging. And I had a hard time writing it for that very fact. And I said to the publisher, I'll only write it if you allow me to spend at least half the book saying what can be done. It's the most fun part of the book, and furthermore, I think it's the area that if there's contributions that I've made or this book has made, it's in that arena. And let me just give you a couple of observations. And I'm just going to spend a few minutes on the most important part of the book. As I wrote it, I tried to understand why these kind of impacts that individuals are having and collectively having. And I came to understand that what's happening in our society is that individuals now view themselves as the decision makers. The internet, the supply chain that I spent my career in, has enabled individuals in the marketplace to be the decision makers. They can buy what they want, where they want, from whatever country, and they can compare prices. They have more information now than the captains of industry had 10 or 20 years ago or 30 years ago. Individuals are now the decision makers. Individuals are the decision makers who cause the demographic dynamics that we're talking about. Women in particular, but individual decision makers on their replacement, on their location, etc. Individual decision making, I'm coming to realize, is the most dominant variable that we need to focus on and understand. And secondly, the other reason why I cite this is that if that's the energy and dynamics leading to these kinds of implications, then can it be used, in fact, to deal with them? And the observations that I wrote about, and I'll just cite the titles in the various chapters, but the first one is that, and it's the most important chapter in the book in my view, and that is no one is disposable. Okay, if you're going to deal with the paradox of growth, then if all the individuals on the planet are having their imprint or footprint, then let's take that footprint and maximize its utilization as opposed to just adding with it. Say, gee, we need more immigrants, we need to bring more people here, we just need to grow like we did in the 50s, 60s. No, I think the most fundamental and important insight is that no one is disposable. The reference point for that chapter was Pope Francis in his latest encyclical on protecting our community. And the insight from that chapter was, and the Pope said, we're all born to work. That's how we, in fact, provide for ourselves and provide for others, and that's the most direct way of doing it, and therefore that's what we need to reflect on, and that is work for everyone, and therefore the chapter and this particular chapter says no one is disposable. We deal with equity not because it's a social cause. We deal with equity because our interdependency requires it. Those who are in jail, those who are not providing for themselves, those who are not able to make it, we need them in order to sustain our economic growth and livelihood. And it creates an imperative, an economic imperative, that it's within our mutual self-interest. This is why I think it's such an important chapter, that our mutual self-interest requires that we, in fact, develop every single individual. And what I came to find out is that we have 12,000 people, or 12 million people, that are working age population that for one reason or another are not working. And it leads to a whole intense and rich discussion about the nature of transfer payments, the nature and dimension around our imprisonment policies, and it adds it adds a need for us to look at those, not because it's something that we're doing because it's the right thing to do, or you have an economic persuasion that says, gee, we've got to be progressive and liberal and provide for all. It adds a dimension that, no, it's an economic necessity that we, in fact, look at every age population and find ways in which they can contribute. In one of the discussions I was forced to deal with, okay, what's automation going to do, et cetera, et cetera. And we don't have enough time to go into those. We can if we want question answers. But let me finish this notion that we're all absolutely that no one is disposable, and that we need to develop everyone, I think is now fast going to become an economic driving force within our politics. A second observation, and that is that if individuals are the decision maker, then we need to decentralize our public functions. We need to decentralize as much as we can so that we bring them into the decision-making mode. And around that concept, I've worked on two projects that I wrote about in the book. One is how we fund infrastructure in the future. And Dan, this came out of some of our joint work, but it led me and others through California Forward to enact a piece of legislation that shows how creating public finance authorities that have the capacity to bundle revenues and to bring them to bear on investment programs is the way we will fund infrastructure, not through our current tax system. If you're facing these kinds of declines in revenues through taxes, you cannot ask people whose consumption is declining, whose income is declining, to just pay more taxes. You're going to have to find ways in which the public goods that we provide, I don't care whether it's in infrastructure or it's all the other sectors, that individuals are going to see that, yes, they're willing to make changes between their own personal decisions and spend more on these particular activities. You're not going to do that through a tax structure. You're going to have to do that through, let's find structures that allow individuals to make those decisions so they'll treat public goods just like they do private goods. And the last observation that I felt, well, the last observation that I felt was important, and I wrote a chapter on it, and that is on the notion of partnerships. How do you create the kind, and I wrote a few examples of partnerships that I thought really worked well. The classic one, and I didn't want to put it in the book, was what I thought Jane did at the museum. She was a public-private partnership that really transformed a museum, but what I wrote about was a school in our actual neighborhood, the village, Charter Village Academy, in which they take girls who are wards of the county and state penal system, who are generally, most of them are unwed mothers. And this particular school, through a very unique set of partnerships, is matriculating their students at the same rate as every high school, public or private, within the county. And they do it because they've created partnerships. And so the concept that I wrote about in the book was that if we created partnerships, and I recently come across a term that I think is really important, hybrid government, where we accomplish our public objectives in partnership format, that the three notions or concepts of decentralization, of no one is disposable, and partnerships, I believe creates the strategy that we can move forward and deal with this paradox of growth in our society.